friends, once again to the next episode in our A to Z of Tudor places. I'm Sarah and I'm the Tudor Travel Guide. And today we are exploring a city which was particularly important in the early part of the Tudor dynasty. We will be looking at a gargantuan fortress of sinister reputation and strategic importance in the realm. Yes, today we are delving into the history of Nottingham Castle in Nottinghamshire, perhaps best known globally for its association with that celebrated medieval do-gooder who took from the rich to give to the poor. Of course, I'm talking about Robin Hood. But we won't be talking about him today. Instead, we will focus on the castle at its zenith in the late 15th and early 16th century. Now, you probably won't know this, but in the 16th century, Nottingham Castle was one of the premier castles in all of England. It was on a par with places like the Tower of London, Windsor or Dover castles in terms of its size, its might and its importance. It was built just after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, and Nottingham Castle soon became and remained for over 500 years the administrative centre of the Midlands, that is, the counties that make up the middle part of England. In its strategic position, close to where a major north-south highway crossed the mighty River Trent, Nottingham Castle became of great importance to medieval and early Tudor kings who wished to control the north of England. Now, however, although the castle, as I've said, pops up in the folklore surrounding Robin Hood, it's virtually never spoken about in relation to its Tudor history, unless you're a particular connoisseur of the reign of perhaps Henry VII. However, I can tell you, my friends, that Nottingham Castle was visited 3 times by Henry VII, including when he used it as his base for the final battle of the Wars of the Roses against the pretender Lambert Simnel in 1487. It was used by Henry VIII in 1511, and also, just to note, Nottingham Castle also played a role in the latter's response to the Pilgrimage of Grace in the late 1530s. And finally, Nottingham Castle was the proposed meeting place between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, which was initially planned for 1562, but a meeting, of course, which never happened. So this location is of some significance if you love your Tudor history. Now here he comes again. John Leyland of the Tudor Antiquary has left us with a fulsome account of the castle town and its approach from his visit, which was in 1537. And I will keep touching on various bits of his description as we go. But as for the town of Nottingham, he simply describes it as large. But what would you have seen if you'd have visited Nottingham back in the day, as Leyland did, approaching from London and the south, of course, along the so-called King's Highway? Well, you would have ridden across pretty low-lying meadows, which often flooded when the nearby rivers of the Leen and Trent were in full spate. Drawing ever closer in front of you and across the far side of the River Leen would have been the imposing town, and that rose gently on a slope of a hill. However, what would have really caught your eye would have been the mighty Nottingham Castle, perched high up on a natural outcrop of sandstone, sheer cliffs just literally falling away on its south side. Now, as I said, the castle was enormous and it covered an area of approximately 10 acres and consisted of not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 courtyards, the upper, middle, outer and northern baileys. And the precipitous rock formations to the west and south and the man-made defences to the east and the north made it, by reputation, one of the most impregnable castles in all of England. Before we reach the 16th century history of the castle, we just cannot overlook its earlier medieval history as this formidable and quite daunting fortress. For it was recorded that in 1212, King John, and I quote, would not eat until he had seen with his own eyes the 28 Welsh Hostages, sons of the most powerful and illustrious families in Wales, hung on the castle walls. Now, horrifyingly to us, these hostages were boys of only 12 to 14 years of age, and it is said that their pitiable cries were plainly audible as they were led to the ramparts and to their deaths. Now move forward some 100 years, and it was at Nottingham Castle that the supporters of King Edward III managed to gain entrance to one of the many underground sandstone passages that had tunnelled out beneath the castle, and they got hold of the king's estranged wife's lover. That's the hated Roger Mortimer, who we came across at Ludlow Castle, by the way, in an earlier A to Z. Now that passageway was to become known henceforth as Mortimer's Hole, and sadly for him, he was subsequently taken from the castle to London to be executed at Tyburn on the 29th of November 1330. But, my friends, for happier times, we can look to the latter part of the 15th century, when Edward IV declared himself king at Nottingham. Yay, happy times. While it was at Nottingham Castle that, as I have said in last month's A to Z, that Richard III and his wife Anne Neville learnt of the death of their only son Edward at Middleham. They, of course, were utterly bereft upon hearing the news. Now, clearly, Richard's elder brother, Edward IV, was very fond of Nottingham and the castle, and he would go on to do some of the most extensive refurbishments of the castle, creating a whole new suite of royal apartments and a grand privy tower across the entire north wall of the Middle Bailey. This meant that the old medieval royal lodgings, which had been in the Inner Bailey, were abandoned by the royal family. John Leyland eulogised about Edward IV's new buildings when he laid eyes on them in 1537. It was around this time that the castle was said to be at the height of its glory, and he writes in his famous itinerary that they were the most beautifulest part and gallant building, a right sumptuous place. But what about the Tudor history of Nottingham Castle? Well, as I mentioned above, Henry VII visited on 3 separate occasions, and happily for us, there are records of the first contained in the Herald's account. And from those accounts we hear that the king was met by the great and good of Nottingham, 1 mile south of that river, before being escorted across the bridges and the meadows that led into the town. And if you want to see more of how that town was laid out around this time, then yet again, there are other images in the blog associated with this video, so you can check out those links that I have just mentioned. And this in fact includes a plan of Nottingham, its town and castle, circa about 1500, and that is being given by kind permission of Andy Nicholson and nottshistory.org.uk. Okay, well, let's go back and talk about the town. Well, at the time, Nottingham was a partially walled town that was entered by one of several gates. By 1537, Leyland noted that much of this castle, or city wall I should say, had fallen down, and that all the gates except 2 or 3 were left standing. However, of course, when Henry VII visited, they may well have still been standing, and therefore we can imagine any royal party must have crossed through those gates and through the heart of the town, travelling east to west across the marketplace towards the castle. And here we can turn to John Leyland once more, because he leaves us with a vivid image of what we might have seen that day. He talks about Nottingham's houses being made of timber and plaster, but very well built, whilst the street is of very great width and an even paved surface. And he concluded that Nottingham's marketplace and street are the finest, without exception, in the whole of England. And John Leyland would know, because he visited most of them. Okay, anyway, eventually the royal party would have entered a street known as Castle Hill, which leads, unsurprisingly, to the first of the castle's gates, part of the perimeter wall. The initial point of entry into Nottingham Castle was via a walled outer bailey, and that, as usual, was a large open space containing actually very few buildings. It certainly was the largest of the castle's 4 courtyards. But on the other side of it, an imposing bridge on pillars carved with beasts and giants, and that is another Leyland quote, leads over a large ditch to reach the middle bailey, via an entrance which Leyland tells us was exceptionally strong with towers and portcullises. Once inside the middle bailey, to your north were the grand sweeping royal lodgings built by Edward IV just 10 years earlier. Leyland describes this range as an exceptionally fine piece of architecture. Now, according to our other old friend, Anthony Emery, architectural historian who studied Nottingham Castle, the ground floor facade was stone built, whereas the upper floor was elaborately framed in timber. So stone on the bottom, timber up top. Now, on the south side of the middle bailey was a cluster of buildings, and these were arranged around what became known as the middle ward, and it included the castle's chapel. And the great hall seems to have stood alone right in the centre of that bailey. Finally, on the highest and most dramatic outcrop of land was the inner ward, which was reached by a separate bridge crossing a dry moat. And this had been the site of the early south-facing medieval palace, including the keep. And as I said, if you want to see pictures and images of that to help you unravel and visualise that arrangement of buildings, do make sure you check out the blog. Again, I've put the link above for a second time, and to remind you, it's also in the description below. But it would, though, have been in Edward IV's lodgings that the likes of Henry VII and later Henry VIII would have lodged. So, a little bit more on what these lodgings looked like. Well, they followed the contours of the curtain walls, and the apartments were, as you might expect, divided into the King and the Queen's privy lodgings. And although today only a ground floor plan exists, Anthony Emery speculates that this arrangement was most likely, i.e. the ground floor arrangement, was most likely repeated at the first floor level, giving both the King and Queen a suite of rooms. However, also accessed from the King's side was Edward IV's so-called Strong Tower. And this was a magnificent structure which Leyland called an excellent goodly tower, and contained the most privy of the King's apartments. It was typical of a 15th century multi-angular structure and was intended to be resilient, as well as being the epitome of fashionable living. So it projected outwards from Henry II's curtain wall. It had a hexagonal frontage and consisted of at least 4 floors. Each floor most likely comprised of one large single chamber with fireplace and adjoining garderobe, toilet, i.e. it was en suite with all the latest luxuries of late 15th century living. 4 windows set into 4 of the hexagonal surfaces of each room must have given breathtaking views across the western edge of the town and the surrounding countryside to the north, particularly from the top floor, which would have been the King's bedchamber. So the question is, what notable events unfolded at Nottingham Castle during the Tudor period? Well, I've mentioned a couple of visits, but without doubt the most dramatic were associated with the founder of the Tudor dynasty, i.e. Henry VII. For it was while the king was lodged at Nottingham on his first visit in 1486 that he heard rumours of a rising in Yorkshire. Now, this was being led by one of the king's remaining arch enemies, Francis Lord Lovell, who was probably plotting to take York and seize the king. Well, the king was travelling towards York and he was at Nottingham en route. Anyway, while Lovell's co-conspirators, the Stafford brothers, were aiming to rouse the Midlands to insurrection. Now, Henry was perturbed enough to send a message to his loyal supporters at Lincoln, where he had just come from. And he was joined at Nottingham Castle by the likes of George Stanley, Lord Strange, the Earl of Oxford and Sir William Stanley. Although, according to Henry's biographer, Temperley, Henry asked the men to come unarmed, perhaps underestimating the seriousness of the rising. Now, Henry VII would return to Nottingham Castle for another pivotal event in his reign the following year, 1487. Just 18 miles or so from the town, Henry's forces faced those of the pretender Lambert Simnel in the Battle of Stoke Field, which took place on the 16th of June. It was in fact to be the final battle in the long-running saga that was known at the time as the Cousins' War. Today we know it as the War of the Roses. One commentator speaks of how the castle was never so grand or well appointed than during Henry VII's reign. However, sadly, there's no record of Henry VII actually spending any money on the castle at Nottingham. He felt, in fact, that castles were prejudicial to his government and the safety of the realm. Thus, according to an early account by Thomas Hine, it was to the, quote, adoption of this policy and his parsimony that we may safely ascribe the decay of Nottingham Castle, end quote. Anyway, by the early 17th century, Nottingham Castle was rapidly falling into decay, and it was therefore subsequently demolished in 1651, following the English Civil War, when Edward IV's tower was deliberately blown up. Shocker. The gatehouse, though leading to the Outer Bailey, survived and can still be seen today. And the foundations of the aforementioned Strong Tower, which was blown up, are apparently still visible in a nearby private garden. The castle site was finally cleared in 1674, leaving very little trace of what was once one of the most important military strongholds, administrative centres and royal palaces in the kingdom. Now, what about if you want to visit Nottingham? Well, Nottingham today, just as it was back 500 years ago, is a major, well, it's not a town anymore, it's a city in the Midlands and well served by all forms of transport. It's a 10-minute walk from the train station and a major car park. And while the city itself is served by buses and electric trams that can take you into the Old Market Square right in the centre. And from there, it's just a short walk to the castle entrance. But details of the castle, its opening times and admission costs, etc., and how to get there can all be found on Nottingham Castle's website, and I'll include a link to that in the description below. Well, my friends, I hope that inspires you to visit Nottingham. It has just undergone a major refurbishment at the time of recording this video, and I think is reopening to the public when COVID and this COVID crisis allows them to do so. So, in the meantime, that's all for today's A to Z, and we, of course, will be returning next month when we tackle the letter O. Where might we be going? Well, I hope you tune in to find out, but in the meantime, all that remains for me to say, my friends, of course, is happy time travelling.